Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that might sound a little bit cryptic at first, the Python Tkinter StringVar. Now, if you've ever tried to build graphical user interfaces with Python, you've probably run into Tkinter. It's kind of like the trusty toolbox for crafting interactive windows and buttons and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Tkinter is definitely a go-to for GUI development with Python.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're going to be relying on a really helpful guide from plus2net.com. They break down everything you need to know about StringVar methods, how to read them, how to update them, and even how to make them react to events in your application.
Plus2Net is a fantastic resource, always clear and concise, even when they're tackling some pretty complex topics.
I totally agree. Okay, so imagine this. You're building a simple app, maybe a text editor,
hmm
and you want the text displayed on the screen to change dynamically as the user types. That's where StringVar comes in. It's kind of like a bridge between your code and what the user actually sees.
That's a really good analogy. StringVar acts as this kind of special container for values that are directly linked to elements in your GUI. So things like text boxes, labels, buttons, that sort of thing.
So instead of messing around with regular Python variables kind of behind the scenes, you use a StringVar to keep everything in sync. That sounds way more intuitive.
It really is. Think of it this way. With a regular variable, you'd have to constantly be checking, has its value changed, and then update the GUI element manually. StringVar just streamlines all of that. Any change to the StringVar automatically updates the linked element, and vice versa.
Okay, so less manual coding, more automatic magic. I like where this is going. But before we get too deep into the how, I'm kind of curious about the why. Why did the creators of Tkinter even choose to go this StringVar route? Was it just to make our lives easier? Or is there like a deeper design reason?
That's a fantastic question, and it touches upon some really fundamental concepts in GUI development. You see, GUIs are what we call event-driven. Things happen in response to user actions, like clicking a button or typing in a field. And StringVar is designed to fit perfectly within this event-driven framework.
Hmm. So it's not just about convenience. It's about how Tkinter is fundamentally structured to handle events and user interactions.
Precisely. StringVar allows Tkinter to very elegantly manage the flow of information between the user interface and the underlying logic of your application.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's not just like a random feature that's thrown in there. It's a key part of how Tkinter applications actually tick. So let's say I'm sold on the idea of StringVar. How do I actually go about creating one of these magical containers in my code?
It's surprisingly straightforward. You use the StringVar class from the Tkinter module. When you create a StringVar, you can optionally give it a starting value and even assign it a name just to make your code more readable.
So it's like declaring a variable, but instead of just saying like x equals 5 fo, you're saying create a string var, maybe call it username, and set it to guest for now or something like that.
You got it. Very similar to regular variable declaration, but with that added power of being directly linked to your GUI elements.
Cool. Now, I have a feeling there's a common pitfall here, a mistake that people new to StringVar often make. Am I right?
You are absolutely right. A very frequent mistake is naming the StringVar string, which unfortunately clashes with Python's built-in string function. That function is used to convert things into text strings. And using the same name for your string var can lead to some unexpected and frustrating bugs.
Oh, so it's like accidentally giving two of your best friends the same nickname. Things are bound to get confusing. So always choose a descriptive name that reflects what that string var actually represents in your application.
Exactly. Clear and descriptive names make your code way easier to understand, both for yourself and for anyone else who might be working with it in the future.
Great advice. Okay, so we've got our string var created. We've named it appropriately. What's next? How do we actually put some data into it? And more importantly, how do we get that data back out when we need it?
That's where two key methods come into play. Set getSet is used to assign a value to the string var, and as you might have guessed, get retrieves the currently stored value. These two are going to be your bread and butter when working with string var in Tkinter.
Okay, to put data in, get to pull data out. Simple enough. But let's get to the really exciting part. How do we actually make something happen when the value of our string var changes? Like if the user types something into an entry field that's linked to a string var, how do we make a label update with that new text?
That is where things get really interesting, and it's all thanks to the powerful traced method.
Ooh, trace it.
Uh,
That sounds intriguing. Like we're setting up a secret agent to watch our string var and report back when something changes.
and that's a fun way to think about it. With traced it, we can attach functions, what we call callback functions, to our string var. These functions are like little instructions that are triggered whenever the string var's value is modified.
Hold on, callback functions. Can you unpack that a little bit for those of us who might not be super familiar with that term?
Of course, imagine you have a friend, and they promise to call you back when they have some news. You don't know exactly when they'll call, but you know that they will when something happens. That's essentially what a callback function does. It just sits patiently until a specific event occurs, like a change to our string var, and then it springs into action, executing whatever code you've written within it.
So we're telling Tinter, hey, when this string var changes, go run this specific piece of code.
Exactly. It's a really powerful way to make our GUI elements dynamically respond to user input, or any changes to the underlying data.
This trace aid is definitely starting to feel like a superpower. But before we dive into all the amazing things we can do with it, let's maybe take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll explore the different ways we can actually use trace aid to build truly interactive and dynamic Tkinter applications.
Sounds good.
Welcome back, everyone. We're in the middle of exploring StringVar, this amazing tool from Tkinter that lets you create truly dynamic and responsive GUI applications. Before the break, we were just about to unravel the mysteries of the trace aid method. You mentioned that there are different ways we can actually use trace. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. Remember, traceAid lets you attach those callback functions, those little snippets of code that spring into action whenever your string var changes. Now you can actually fine-tune how that callback is triggered using different modes: read, write, and unset.
Okay, so it's not just any change that will trigger the callback. We could be specific about what kind of change needs to happen.
Exactly. Write is probably the mode you'll use most often. It triggers the callback whenever the string var's value is directly modified. So for example, when the user types something into an entry field that's linked to that string var.
So every keystroke the user makes would trigger that callback function. That makes sense. What about the read mode? When would we use that?
Read is a bit more subtle. It triggers the callback whenever the string var's value is accessed, even if it's not actually changed. For example, if you use the get method to display the string var's value in a label, that would trigger a callback function set to read mode.
Interesting. So even just peeking at the value, so to speak, can trigger a reaction. And what about unset? That one sounds a little mysterious.
Unset is definitely the least common mode, and it's triggered when a string var is deleted or if its value is cleared. It's there for those kind of special cases where you need to perform specific actions when a string var is essentially removed from your application.
Okay, I'm starting to get a clearer picture of these different modes. Write for when the value changes, read for when the value is accessed, and unset for when the string var itself is removed or cleared. But I'm a hands-on learner. Do you have any concrete examples of how these modes are used in real Tkinter applications?
Absolutely. Remember that example from plus2net.com where they used trace to count the characters in an entry field? So every time you press a key, the label updates to show you the count. That example really beautifully illustrates the power of traceAid in write mode.
Right. Each keystroke modifies that string var that's linked to the entry field, and that triggers the callback function, which updates the label with the new character count.
Precisely. It's a very simple example, but it demonstrates how traceAid enables these real-time updates in your GUI, making your applications feel incredibly interactive.
I can already see how useful that would be for things like, creating password strength meters, where the display changes based on the number and complexity of characters typed in, or even for enforcing character limits in text fields.
You got it. The possibilities are pretty much endless. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about another powerful technique that was mentioned in the Plus2Net guide, using a single string var to actually control multiple widgets. Now this might sound a bit strange at first, but it's a really elegant way to simplify your code and keep things synchronized.
Yeah, that technique really stood out to me when I was reading through the guide. It seemed like a really great way to keep the GUI organized and just make sure that all the different elements are always on the same page, so to speak.
Exactly. Imagine you're building a simple login form. You have an entry field for the username, a welcome message that greets the user by name, and maybe a button that clears both the entry field and the welcome message. Instead of creating separate variables for each of these elements, you can actually link them all to the same string var.
Wait, so if I change the text in the username entry field, the welcome message would automatically update with the new name, and clicking that clear button would wipe both the entry field and the welcome message simultaneously.
That's exactly it. By using that single string var, you just ensure that all those elements stay in sync effortlessly. It's a brilliant way to streamline your code and reduce the chances of errors.
Wow, that's incredibly powerful, It's like StringVar acts as the conductor of an orchestra, making sure that all the different instruments are playing in harmony. Now, I'm also intrigued by the example in the Plus2Net guide where they use StringVar to update a label with random text from a list at regular intervals. It sounds like a fun way to add some, dynamic visual elements to a GUI.
It is. You could use that technique to create things like a scrolling news ticker, a display that cycles through, like inspirational quotes, or even a simple game where elements on the screen change over time.
It's amazing how much flexibility StringVar offers. It's not just about user input. It can also be used to drive animations or create timed events within your application.
It really highlights the versatility of StringVar. It's this key building block for crafting dynamic and engaging user interfaces.
Okay, I'm completely sold on StringVar. It's clearly an essential tool for any Tkinter developer. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I have one kind of lingering question. If StringVar is so fantastic for monitoring changes and creating these interactive experiences, how did people even manage before it existed? Was there a more cumbersome way of achieving similar results?
You've hit upon a crucial point. Before StringVar and its very clever event-driven approach, Pointer developers had to rely on more manual methods. They would essentially poll regular Python variables, constantly checking, has it changed, and updating the GUI accordingly.
So it was a lot more work, a lot more code to write, and probably more prone to errors.
Exactly. StringVar streamlined that whole process, making it significantly easier and more intuitive to build truly responsive applications.
Wow. It's amazing how tools evolve to make our lives easier and our code more efficient. Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've demystified what StringVar is, how to create and manipulate it, and we've touched on the incredible power of the traceAid method for creating those dynamic updates. I feel like I have a pretty solid grasp of this powerful tool now.
Me too. I always love seeing how people take these tools and build incredibly creative applications with them. But before you go off and start coding your next masterpiece, there's one more kind of crucial aspect of StringVar that I think we should touch upon: performance.
Oh, right. We've talked about how StringVar simplifies things. But does using it add any overhead compared to just using regular Python variables? Does all this behind-the-scenes magic come at a cost?
That's a really important question, and it's one that any thoughtful developer should consider. Let's unpack that. Maybe right after a short break.
Sounds good to me. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Tkinter's StringVar. Right before the break, we were just about to tackle that question of performance. Does using StringVar come with a performance hit compared to just using regular Python variables?
Yeah, it's a great question, and one that's really important to consider, especially if you're building applications that need to be super responsive or handle a ton of data.
So spill the beans. Does StringVar slow things down?
Well, the truth is, there is a tiny bit of overhead associated with StringVar compared to plain variables. I mean, think about it. Tkinter is doing extra work behind the scenes,
Yeah.
tracking changes, updating widgets, triggering those callback functions.
Right, so there's a trade-off. We gain all this flexibility and ease of use, but potentially at the cost of a little bit of speed.
Exactly. But the good news is that in most common Tkinter applications, this performance difference is negligible, unless you're dealing with extremely complex GUIs or real-time systems with super strict timing requirements.
Wow.
It's unlikely you'll even notice any slowdown.
Okay, that's reassuring. So for most, everyday Tkinter projects, the benefits of StringVar far outweigh any potential performance concerns.
Absolutely. The clarity, the organization, the ease of development that StringVar brings to the table are just invaluable. Plus, it can actually help improve performance in some cases.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, remember how we talked about how StringVar eliminates the need to manually check for changes in variables and update widgets? That manual approach can actually be less efficient, especially if you're constantly pulling variables that rarely change.
Ah, I see. So by using StringVar, we're kind of offloading some of that work to Tkinter, which can handle it more efficiently in a lot of cases.
Precisely. It's not just about convenience. It's about letting Tkinter do what it does, best manage the flow of information in your GUI.
This has been such an enlightening deep dive. I feel like I've gone from being kind of intimidated by StringVar to truly appreciating its power and elegance. It's like going from fumbling around with the toolbox to discovering a well-organized workshop with all the right tools in their place.
I love that analogy. StringVar is definitely one of those tools that once you understand how to use it, just makes building Tkinter applications so much smoother and more enjoyable.
So as we wrap up our exploration here, What would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners? What's that one key insight about StringVar that you really hope they'll carry with them?
I think the most crucial takeaway is that StringVar is all about making it easier to build dynamic and responsive GUIs. It provides this elegant mechanism for linking your data to the visual elements of your application and just ensuring that everything stays synchronized effortlessly.
Like StringVar takes care of all the plumbing behind the scenes,
Yeah.
so we can just focus on crafting that user experience.
Exactly. It frees us up to think about the logic, the flow, the interactions that make our GUIs truly engaging.
Well said. And, for those listening who might be wondering if there are any alternatives to StringVar, Tkinter actually offers a few specialized versions, like intvar for integers and Boolean var for true-false values. These work very similarly to StringVar, but they're specifically designed to handle certain data types.
That's right. Tkinter's got you covered for a variety of different scenarios, but at the end of the day, the core principles of linking data, tracking changes, and triggering actions remain the same. It's all about creating those seamless and intuitive interactions that make our GUIs really come alive.
Fantastic. I think we've successfully demystified the StringVar, explored its nuances, and showcased its incredible potential for building really amazing Tkinter applications.
Absolutely. And I encourage all our listeners to dive into Tkinter, experiment with StringVar, and see what amazing creations you can come up with.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Python Tkinter StringVar. Until next time, happy coding.